Welcome to Life Groups. Life Groups are an opportunity for us to build community with one another, to develop some spiritual friendships, and to walk alongside one another as we grow in grace. This particular year, we're going to be looking at a question that emerges in the Gospels. Who is my neighbor? It's a question that emerges in the Gospel of Luke. There's a lawyer who comes to Jesus asking, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what are the commandments?" And the man responds, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus says, "You got it. Do this, and you will live." And the man said, "Well, who is my neighbor?" In response to that question, Jesus told a story. There was a man who was walking down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho when he stumbled and fell and hurt himself, and he was in a ditch. A priest walked by, saw the man, and passed by on the other side. A Levite came by, and just so came by, saw the man, passed by on the other side. There was a third man, a Samaritan, who came, and when he saw the man, he was moved with compassion, and he helped the man. He bandaged him up, and he took him to an inn, paid all his medical bills and expenses, and said, "If you need to pay any more money, I'll come back and fit the bill at the end of his stay." Jesus tells the story, and then he asks this question: which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man? The lawyer replied, "The one who showed mercy." Jesus says, "Go and do likewise." Now, y'all know this story. It's a familiar story. You probably also know that for Jesus's people, the Jewish people, they despised the Samaritans. And for Jesus to make a Samaritan the hero of his story was a way for Jesus to challenge and offend his listeners. Jesus was trying to expand the understanding of his listeners, the way that they understood what it means to be a neighbor. He was also trying to expand the circle of concern and compassion, challenging even who we might think of as neighbors. Now, we also know that we live in a world that's just as divided by prejudice and history, by race and ethnicity as Jesus' time. Just turn on the news and you see mass shootings and global terror and brutal racism. We're still divided by fears that we feel and judgments that we make towards one another, towards people that we think of as other than us, as a threat to us. And it's important to ask the question, who is my neighbor? And to consider what it might look like to expand our own circle of concern. But we know all this, and the question really is not do we know it, but is it possible for us to act on it? In the 1970s at Princeton University, there was a group of psychologists who decided to put on a study asking questions about whether knowing about the Good Samaritan story, thinking about it, would change anybody's behavior or not. So they went to the seminary, Princeton Seminary, and they made a deal with the professors. They were going to do a particular study with students. Part of the students were going to be assigned a task to prepare a sermon on the Good Samaritan story. Other students were assigned a different text. And after their teaching, there was going to be a person, unbeknownst to the students, who was going to be positioned, a person who was going to need help, positioned outside the school building. Well, the day came for the study. The students did their lesson, and then all the students went out and passed by this person outside the school building who was struggling and in need of help. Well, it turned out that knowing the Good Samaritan story and even teaching it and preaching it didn't change anyone's behavior at all. That wasn't the key factor. The key factor, it turned out, was who was in a hurry or not. If somebody was on the way to another class or needed to get to work, they didn't stop. The people who stopped were the ones who weren't in such a hurry, who weren't so busy. And I think that's the way it is, right? The difference for us in knowing who our neighbor is is perhaps not the crucial factor. The crucial factor often for us is busyness, hurriedness, and maybe worry that we're going to miss out on the next thing. The same thing that prevented the students and maybe even the Levite and the priest in the story from stopping may not have been a desire to help or knowledge about what to do, but being so overwhelmed by the next task that you don't stop, that you don't feel compassion, much less act on it. Wayne Muller, in his book Sabbath, Finding Rest, Renewal, and Delight in Our Busy Lives, says this: a successful life has become a violent enterprise. We make war on our bodies, pushing them beyond their limits, war on our children because we cannot find enough time to be with them when they are hurt or afraid and need our company, war on our spirit because we're too preoccupied to listen to the quiet voices that seek to nourish and to refresh us, war on our communities because we are fearful of protecting what we have and we don't feel safe enough to be kind or generous, war on the earth itself because we cannot take the time to place our feet on the ground and allow it to feed us and taste its blessings and give thanks. Part of the problem, I think, for us is a kind of hectic, overwhelming busyness that we're all wrapped up in that causes violence even to our own souls. It's perhaps not of the same level as the kinds of prejudice and hatred that we see in the world, but it's on the same spectrum. Part of the issue, I think, for us is to recognize that we have been beat down and overburdened, and some of us feel like we're in the ditch ourselves, unable to get up and out to help anyone else. We need to remember that God is here to pick us up, to bandage our wounds, to heal us, and to send us out with grace so that we have the capacity to love others well. And there are a number of things that we'll talk about tonight and in the weeks ahead, but maybe ask yourself what it might look like for you to experience Sabbath rest, to pause, not just to do the chores or to do things around the house, but to experience life-giving, nourishing rest. It might be the first step for you in not just asking, who is my neighbor, but how might I develop the capacity to show and feel compassion towards my neighbor in a new way.